Well, hello, and thank you for joining me today. I've got a very special guest that I'm really excited about to talk about a topic that, dentists and, I've been quite passionate about for some time, in that the way dietary sugars affect not only our health, but especially our children's health. And there's been some really interesting progressions on how we are discussing this topic and how we are starting to educate people and parents about understanding the ways that sugars affect not only their health, but their children's health, and how we can help them to raise kids that aren't affected by the negative health impacts of sugar. Dr. Michael Goran, thank you so much for joining me today. I thought just to start off with, we would begin with your story on how you, because you've been in this area for quite some time that you've been researching um, the metabolic effects of sugar for some years. How did you what were some of the first steps in that you took into really diving into the world of sugar in the body?
Yeah, thanks. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me on. So nice to be here. Yeah, you can tell from my gray beard. I've been doing this for a while, right? I've actually, my research for over 30 years has always been focused on childhood nutrition, just because I started off being very interested in nutrition and interested in growth and development and how nutrition affects growth and development. And we started looking at how that becomes problematic with obesity and excess weight gain. We started off looking at diet and its impact, not just on weight gain, but on early signs of chronic disease that we were starting to see around 2000 for type 2 diabetes, and then in 2010 for fatty liver disease. We're starting to see earlier progression of those chronic diseases in childhood. And we started to ask, well, what's the dietary component? And we weren't initially targeting sugar as a factor. We were just looking generally, but in multiple studies around the mid to late 2000s and 2010s, we started seeing sugar. So sugar was popping up in all these analyses as linking diet to not just weight gain, but signs of progressive chronic disease, diabetes, fatty liver, cardiovascular disease. So it just kind of kept coming up. I like to say I follow the data. Data talks louder than people in my world. And so we followed the data and started to dig deeper into the weeds of how sugar affects health in children.
It's true, because I mean, if we're talking, 2 decades ago, around the 2000s, you really have to take yourself back, and the conversation of sugar and its link to obesity really wasn't discussed at all in the mainstream era. What were some of the trends you were seeing in terms of how obesity was changing in those early stages? What were some of the in terms of how we were seeing a younger generation being affected by obesity?
When I started off in that field, which would have been, now we're going back to the previous millennium. So, when I started off doing research in obesity in childhood, it was really very understudied and very limited information. And it was mostly just kind of shrugged off concern of chubby kids. They'll grow out of it kind of a syndrome. And there wasn't really a lot known about how that early weight gain would translate to earlier progression of those chronic diseases. And then I think a big turning point was around 2000, 1999, something like that, when they started the first studies on the emergence of type 2 diabetes in children. It used to be called adult onset diabetes. And that changed. And it's not just that it's emerging in early life, but onsets earlier in life. Pre-diabetes is becoming highly prevalent. So I think we started to see a flip around then.
And we're talking about age groups, from adolescence and then into pediatric age groups too. What are some of the numbers around that were starting to pop up?
For for
for
obesity.
pediatric diabetes?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the actual prevalence or instance of type 2 diabetes, even though it's increasing, thankfully, nationally, it's not a large number, but it is higher in segments of the population, like it's higher among Latinos and Native Americans, in Blacks. So the prevalence in teenagers is still in the single digit percent wise. It's very low, but the rate of increase is increasing. And if you look at pre-diabetes, so if you look just among overweight or obese kids, then you see, for example, 35% of overweight and obese kids will have pre-diabetes. So we're definitely seeing striking numbers for those subclinical stages. And the same for fatty liver. So among overweight and obese children, we're seeing prevalences of fatty liver disease of about 30% too.
The numbers of pre-diabetes, I remember, was one of the first times I began to think about this systemic effect of sugar. That really kind of, it was a light bulb moment for me where I thought, wow, there's things we're potentially missing. Obviously in the dental chair and in the dental sphere, we see the front-on effects of sugar quite vividly with teeth breaking down. But then the idea that you can have this subclinical presentation of the effect of sugar really did start to think that, wow, we need to start thinking about this in a much broader sense, in that you can have this long this long disease progression that is affected by what you eat every day. That was such a turnaround for myself in terms of how I was beginning to understand how we can help our patients understand this.
Yeah, I mean, for me too, that's been the driving force of a lot of my research. Really, is just kind of realizing that this is kind of a long term. It's like the classic metaphor of a frog boiling, slowly in a pot of water versus dumping it in a pot of boiling water. We're kind of watching the frog cook in a slowly boiling pot of water, and because it's slowly boiling, we're not really taking full notice of it, because a lot of these conditions also are silently progressing. So type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, cardiovascular, I mean, these early stages are fairly silent in terms of outward symptoms.
In terms of, just to get this rock solid in people's minds, would you be able to kind of just paint how the consumption of everyday sugars drives the mechanism of type 2 diabetes? Because there is a little bit of discussion on whether the main mechanism of type 2 diabetes is the consumption of carbohydrates or simple sugars. What have you seen, and how would you describe that? Because to me, it seems pretty simple, but there is still some argument, would you say, in terms of what the actual mechanism is?
I think there's definitely some discussion, and it's never going to be as simple as one factor causing type 2 diabetes. So, and that's what we by the way, our book is Sugarproof, which we wrote to summarize a lot of these findings that we're going to talk about. And again, it's not definitive. Proving association for these things is not easy. But when we looked at the kind of combined evidence, sugar emerges as a driving factor, as a recurring across studies, and we reviewed all that in the book. So I think it's still open to debate. Nobody would say that it's the only factor, but it's certainly a major factor, and it's a modifiable factor, and one that's fairly, in principle, in theory, not difficult to change. I know that that's hard in practice, but it's a modifiable driving factor.
In terms of pediatric diabetes, there has been, in terms of nailing down their dietary sugar intake, what have kind of been some of the numbers in terms of consumption rates and what's driving the disease? Have there been some studies looking at that?
And well, there's various. I mean, there's lots of individual studies. But I'm thinking of, for example, one meta-analysis that reviewed almost a dozen studies. For example, this is in adults. I think they showed that for every one serving per day of sugar-sweetened beverages consumed by adults, there's a 30% increase in risk for type 2 diabetes.
Which is quite concerning when you think about the consumption, especially in the Western world,
Yeah.
of these beverages. It is this prevalent, and these kind of, the how potentially harmful to our health, the one of these drinks really can be. Michael, I think some people might be a little bit confused, a little bit, as to how sugar drives obesity. Are you able to explain that a little bit, as to how the body stores sugar, and how we become overweight from eating too much sugar?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think I thought you were going to ask about the links with cardiovascular disease, and which is also counterintuitive, and we can talk about that later. But the links between sugar and sugary beverages and obesity are actually less clear. So the links are clear for type 2 diabetes, and they're actually clearest for cardiovascular disease. So we will talk about that. But in terms of obesity, it's mostly just probably a caloric imbalance, even though I'm probably going to say at some point today it's not just about the calories. But for diabetes and cardiovascular disease and fatty liver, and even tooth decay, the problem with sugar is nothing to do with the calories, right? But for obesity, it is to do with the calories, because normally sugary beverages, very calorically dense, low to zero nutrient quality. Sugars, and we're not just talking about sugary beverages there, we're talking about hidden sugars and added sugars that are added to processed food that tend to make them taste better, and therefore you eat more. It's addictive. So I think we're talking generally broadly about the kind of addictive process, the addictive elements of highly processed foods where added sugars are kind of highly prevalent. So it's more to do with that in terms of obesity and just the energy imbalance that it might cause. I think the links are actually clear metabolically with those other conditions, which has nothing to do with the calories. So we have to think beyond the calories.
We'll definitely dive into those other mechanisms. It's really interesting to see all of the effects systemically of what sugar can really do. More recently, we've been talking about gut health and how the gut-brain system is affected by our diet. Is there some link, do you think, between how gut microbes are affected by simple sugar consumption and weight gain?
Absolutely. I mean, we can't definitively draw the connection between sugar, microbiome to weight gain. We're working on that. We're doing studies, research on that now in human patients, actually in babies, to look at it in early life. For sure, we've published some of the first studies from animal models showing the links between excess sugar consumption and major alterations in the gut microbiome in developing rodents. In humans, we've also just published studies on links between different types of added sugars that are added into the diet early, and how early introduction of sugars can affect gut dysbiosis and microbiome alterations. We're not fully ready to draw the line between the upstream effects from that, but we're certainly looking at it as a hypothesis about how that alteration in the gut microbiome then may lead to alterations in brain development, in weight gain, and other chronic diseases. I think that's a major aim of our ongoing research currently, actually.
It's an exciting area where it seems like we can understand our bodies in such finite yet detailed we can really get into how the mechanisms and how as simple as one densely caloric meal can really affect our body. Michael, let's dive into just before we start. You did mention tooth decay, and this is something obviously that I've worked on a lot, and the dental community has been jumping up and down about for some time, saying that we need to reduce the sugar. And some may argue that we've not done it effectively to the point where people like yourself have had to write books and explain how it affects us through the body. But it's interesting to follow how the diet affects potentially the mouth first, and then runs into sometimes generations later, because if we think about the tooth decay epidemic, it really rises in the 70s and 80s, and then we really do see type 2 diabetes popping up after that. We're talking about a chronic consumption here of a food staple that's been placed and in high concentrations through these times. How does this begin to link through the bodies? Have you seen some of the connections between some of these conditions? And then we've mentioned in cardiovascular disease, because there are links between oral disease and cardiovascular disease. What are the links between sugar and how our risk of heart disease increases?
Yeah, that's to do with metabolically how the body processes different types of sugar. And in particular, we're going to talk about glucose and fructose, which are two simple sugars that are joined together in sucrose, right? So ordinary sugar is glucose joined together with fructose, which then break apart in the body. Both of those sugars are identical chemically, but have very different fates in the body. So glucose, as we know, is used all over the body. That's the sugar in your blood. When we talk about blood sugar, used in all parts of the body for energy, and it's combusted to carbon dioxide and water. The uptake is insulin dependent and is highly tightly regulated. Fructose, on the other hand, is very, very different. It's not insulin dependent uptake. Almost all fructose, especially when a lot of it is consumed at once, is cleared by the liver. And so the liver, of course, its job is to clear nasty things out of the blood, like toxins and alcohol. We'll add to that list fructose. So all that fructose that gets broken off for sugar is taken up by the liver. It's not used for energy. Small amount of it might be converted to glucose for energy. Most of it is filtered out by the liver, where it's converted into fat. And that process is pro-inflammatory, produces uric acid as a byproduct, which is inflammatory. So that's where we get the links between sugars and inflammation. And then the fructose is converted into fats or lipids, which either get stuck in the liver, and that's where you get fatty liver disease, or those lipids get repackaged out into blood, which is where you get dyslipidemia, high cholesterol, high triglycerides. That comes from sugar. So the lipids in your blood, the dyslipidemia that you get screened when you go to the doctor, some of those are processed from sugar. And so there's actually very clear evidence from population-based studies linking high sugar to death from cardiovascular disease and subclinical outcomes too.
It's fascinating when you see the mechanism and the way you describe, this kind of played out over decades in terms of, we saw the rise in obesity, the rise in diabetes, and then the understanding of how the liver is affected. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. The presentation of that, I think some people might be a bit confused about that. You've described the mechanism quite well. Can you describe how? Well, firstly, sucrose and is splits up into glucose and fructose. So that's what someone will eat when they eat table sugar, and then the body breaks it down differently. So it will use glucose. Every cell in the body uses glucose, and this is what releases insulin from the brain, and then fructose goes to the liver. Can you explain that metabolic pathway? Is there no purpose for that, or is there some purpose that gets overloaded in the modern day world? What's your take on that?
I think it is an overload. So, and basically the machinery was not designed for the diet that we're eating today. So if you eat an apple, for example, which is what we were evolutionary from an evolutionary perspective, that's what we were adapted to, eating whole foods. There, the release of fructose is very slow, and studies have shown. We haven't shown this in humans, but there's been studies in animals. It's dose dependent. So when there's a slow release of fructose, the gut can actually convert some of that fructose into glucose and use it for energy. The pathway that I described is rate limiting, and it gets rate limiting based on the concentration of fructose that hits the liver. So under, pre-1960s, 1970s diet, when sugar consumption was low, and we didn't have we didn't have 200 names for sugar, some of which are high in fructose. When we were just eating fruit instead of drinking it, we didn't reach that threshold. So the body was able to cope with the slow release of fructose coming predominantly from fruit and the small amounts in added sugar. But fast forward 50 years, added sugar is in over 70% of processed foods. We're drinking fruit, not eating fruit. Now suddenly we've tipped the balance. There's lots of other different sugars that are higher in fructose, like the fruit-based sugars, high fructose corn syrup. It's tilted the balance towards more fructose, and more fructose coming in much faster. That overwhelms that normal capacity that I just described. So yeah, it's maladaptation of our normal metabolism to a new food environment.
The idea that our children's livers are getting clogged up with fat is quite concerning, and so especially considering when we think about the connections to heart disease that you described so well. How much sugar is a child consuming to push them into the risk category for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? What are the presentations, and how is the research showing that is there reversibility in this for younger generations?
Yeah, I take that last question first because that's the good news. It is reversible, and studies have shown in kids with fatty liver, or even earlier on in the process, if you reduce sugar, you can eliminate fat from the liver, or at least reduce it. So it's definitely reversible. Several studies have shown that, including in children. The problem is the problem itself is, like I mentioned, very silent. So you could have progressive accumulation of fat in the liver going on for decades and you'd never know it. It's usually associated with excess weight gain, but not always. So you can certainly have kids who aren't obviously overweight or gaining a lot of weight who might be accumulating fat in the liver. We also know that accumulation of fat in the liver is more likely to happen among certain segments of the population, like among Hispanic kids. We've seen fatty liver at very early ages, and that's partly genetic. And the same may be true in other segments of the population as well. So it's a very difficult process to actually measure. Clinically, if you suspected it, you would do an ultrasound. In our studies, we do MRI, so that's obviously out of reach for most people, but you can fairly well assume that most kids are getting too much sugar. And if you're at all concerned about fatty liver, reducing it will alleviate that concern. So you don't have to wait for 20 years for it to show up.
Absolutely. And one of the one of the issues in our children that has really risen in the last, probably decade, but maybe a little bit longer, are the rise in behavioral issues. Now, in your book, there's an excellent chapter on the effect of sugar on the brain. And, when we talk about metabolic issues, I think weight gain can maybe seem a little bit benign. People can maybe shrug it off. But when we talk about the brain and the development of a child neurologically, then things start to get a bit, very frank. And I feel this is where maybe the sugar conversation can really start to hit home for people, in that how sugar is affecting the brain. Now, are you seeing a link between sugar consumption and the rise in certain attention issues in children, and how their consumption of these sugars is affecting their behavior and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, the title of the book is The Hidden Dangers of Sugars and the Risk, the hidden dangers of sugar. So that when we're talking about the hidden dangers of sugar, it's the ones that we wouldn't be thinking about. Like, most parents would see if their kids were getting too much weight, but we don't necessarily link that with altered cognitive development or neurological development. And so studies all over the world in different countries have shown, not a lot of studies, we need more research on this for sure, but certainly there's fairly good studies showing links between kids who consume a lot of sugar having compromised test scores and academic test scores in school, for example, affecting memory performance, affecting stress and adaptation to stress. So there's definitely work supporting that line of evidence. How does it work mechanistically? We don't know. We mentioned the links with the microbiome. That might be one such link, because gut microbiome, we know, affects brain development. It may start very early. We're also looking at early introduction of sugars and how that affects the brain. We know that during critical periods of brain development, that bad nutrition can permanently rewire the brain. We've learned that from animal studies, where we can very carefully study increases in sugar during, let's say, rat adolescence. So rats go through adolescence, but it's just for 30 days. If we expose adolescent rats to sugar just during that window of adolescence, and in a rat, the brain rapidly develops during that period, you can permanently alter their memory, their ability to find their way out of a maze, for example. So it's also a lot to do with not just the effects of sugar on the body, but how sugar affects development. The tooth is a perfect example of that, because teeth are developing. You know better than I. And that's why kids are more susceptible to the effects of sugar. But the same is true in the brain. If the brain is developing, if the heart is developing, if your gut microbiome is developing, it's going to be much more likely to be affected by adverse exposures like too much sugar.
A lot of parents now are dealing with kids that are, very connected to sugar. And, it's probably difficult to bring the term addiction in, but you talk about it in the book. How would you frame the role of sugar in the diet as being addictive for a child, and its effect on the brain, and how the brain becomes, potentially addicted to a dietary input like sugar?
Yeah, it's a loaded term, addiction, isn't it? And well, I just kind of put that aside. And we can call it addiction or not, but the way we looked at it in the book in Sugarproof was to look at the elements of addiction. So the clinical definition of addiction, it's something that you crave a lot. It's something that you have a hard time giving up. It's something that when you do give it up, the body has a bad response to it. So almost all of the clinical criteria for addiction, you see with sugar. So whether you call it an addiction or not, you can if you want, but the, the issue is those criteria are there. We know that kids crave sugar, and we know the more sugar they get, the more they crave it. Same is true for adults, it's not just children. So we know those criteria for addiction are there, and we know that they can be overcome. So I talk more. I don't talk about addiction because it's a bit of a lightning rod. I do talk about cravings for sugar, because most parents are well aware of uh, their kids craving sugar, and it doesn't have to be that way.
And parents will, and they'll often experience kids that are maybe suffering symptoms of cravings, so withdrawal symptoms and so forth, headaches,
Exactly.
moodiness,
Exactly.
sugar crash in the afternoon, things like this. These are the signs you think that the parents should be watching out for kids that are maybe craving too much sugar?
Well, those issues are more to do with the acute effects of too much sugar, and and some of those will be problematic if you go off of sugar, but they're short-lived and can be overcome. But since you mentioned it, this issue of spikes and crashes is important for parents, because that's to do with the daily sugar roller coaster of how kids in particular are very, again, susceptible, because they're very efficient at processing sugar. And so if kids are feeding off of sugar, they are much more likely to become hyper. So if if a 5-year-old eats an ice cream, or if a 5-year-old drinks a glass of juice versus an adult, the adult's not usually bouncing off the wall, but the kids are. And that's because glucose is much more rapidly taken up. And then the subsequent crash is about how kids are much more efficient at withdrawing that sugar out of the blood, because the body wants it for energy and for growth. And so because there's such a rapid spike, it rapidly falls and it goes below normal. And that's when you become hypoglycemic, or for a parent, that means your kids are rolling around on the floor having a tantrum. That's usually to do with a rapid fall in blood glucose. And you can get into a daily cycle, because when that happens, you tend to kind of then say, okay, here's another high sugary snack or a glass of juice. And then the kids get revived, and then you're in this up and down cycle all day long.
Within that, the clinical classification of addiction to, there's this idea of tolerance, and obviously today we have there's an abundance of access to the really highly concentrated, high caloric sugary drinks and snacks. Is there a tolerance that children are potentially building to a high sugar diet, and is this going to maybe mask some of the symptoms, or how will that kind of, do you feel, affects their growth and development cycle?
Yeah, I think it's to do with this, again, comes back to this issue of craving sugar. So babies are actually born with a built-in preference for sugar, supposed to help them like breast milk, which is sweet, and to seek out healthy calories and to avoid food that had got spoiled or toxic berries. But of course, that's not what they're fed on now, typically high sugary diets. And what happens is you can increase that preference for sweetness. And so kids end up liking things to be sweeter and craving more sweetness, which ends up meaning eating more food and wanting stuff that's sweeter. So I don't know if there's a tolerance or an upper limit to that, but I think it certainly gets magnified or increased until you can basically increase that craving even more, higher and higher. But the good news is you can also dampen it down by eliminating sugar. Not forever necessarily, but even short periods can have a big effect.
And there's some evidence emerging that even exposure in utero may have an effect on a growing child, which is really kind of showing us the full spectrum of how sugar affects our lives. Is that something you're seeing emerging in the research?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's and that's true for actual sugar as well as alternative sweeteners that we may talk about at some point. But either way, kids who are exposed in utero to excess sugar, um, that built-in preference for sweetness that I mentioned a moment ago, for example, that can be amplified by exposure to sugar in utero. And there's plenty of studies that show that high exposure in utero to sugar can be associated with problems later in life. We call that the developmental origins of disease. Development meaning in utero development in this particular situation.
Your book covers so well all of the different avenues that we're seeing the mechanisms of sugar driving chronic disease, and I really recommend people jump into that. And we've kind of for me, I really feel that the connection between what we eat and how we understand those mechanisms through the body is sometimes a bit of a difficult jump. But sugar really it's starting to paint out, and your work has really helped for people to understand that. In the second half of the interview, I'd like to jump into more of the practical ways that we can remove sugar from our diet. As we mentioned, parents in particular. One of the big things with sugar is that it seems to drive an appetite center in the brain. And so, how can we break these cycles of we'll say craving, and what is happening in the brain when we've fed it sugar in terms of appetite, and then we'll start to jump into maybe some measuring how much sugar we're consuming and so forth.
Yeah, I think that I'm glad you brought that up. I'd love to talk about this part because it's not all doom and gloom in terms of there's actually stuff you can do, and it can start with very simple things. I think a lot of parents get very easily overwhelmed with trying to fix this problem, but I think it can start with very small adjustments. It doesn't have to be it can be gradual as well over time, that you can gradually move towards a healthier, less sugary diet. But there's lots of simple tips that you can apply that we talk about in Sugarproof.
Absolutely. And you've got two daughters, is that right?
Yeah. Well, two. I definitely have two daughters, and the reason I kind of hesitated is because one's almost 19. So, she's almost she's still a daughter, but definitely transitioning to an adult.
How has this? I mean, you've been in this space for quite some time now. How have you seen this? As a parent, your perception in the home of what your children are eating. Have you seen a shift in that? Say, Dr. Michael Goran 10 years ago compared to what's happening now. Would there be a difference that you'd see in what's going on the breakfast table and so forth in your house?
I think so. I would like to hope so. I still definitely get a lot of eye rolls from my kids. There's no question. Probably every parent does, but and we and in the book as well. I think we've always tried not to be too strict about it, because I think there's a real danger of that backfiring. And I mean, I think the basic sense of the book is to try and get kids involved and have them understand how food in general affects their body and have them involved. And we as a family have always liked the process of eating and sharing, and we cook together and eat together daily. I'm not going, my kids still like sweet treats just like any other kids, but I mean, I like to think that they're a bit more aware of how it's affecting their body and self-regulating it, because that's what we're also trying to do, get kids to kind of self-regulate better. we've done this. We do the 7-day sugar fast periodically as a family, and I think that helps reset things. I'm definitely the outlier in my family for sure, um, but I think they're a lot more, certainly a lot more informed and a lot more on board. But it doesn't mean to say they're perfect, and you don't have to be perfect. That's the whole thing. Like, we're not saying you can never eat sugar again. It's bad. You should never have it. That's just not going to work. And so rather than that, we like to say, okay, we're having ice cream tonight. Great. Let's maybe, let's all get ice cream together and have a nice fun evening, and maybe have a little portion and save some more for the next time. And let's make some cookies and make them extra yummy. So lots of different things that we do as a family, I think, that try to change the narrative and be more aware and enjoy food and enjoy the celebration and the joy that comes with sweet food, and not let it kind of overrun our bodies.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And one of the biggest pushes in probably global consciousness quite recently was the World Health Organization acknowledging that we need to start thinking about removing or at least understanding the how much sugar we're having in our diet. It was 2016, was it, or 17, where they brought in new guidelines as to what they recommended people eat in terms of added sugar. That was kind of a reaction to the swathe of evidence that was building,
Yep.
this chronic disease epidemic. It was probably one of the best public health announcements I'd seen in my time as being a health practitioner. Can you help people? What was that announcement, and can you just describe what the World Health Organization guides us to eat in terms of added sugar?
Yeah, I can't remember. I think my memory is like 2012, something like that. So I think you were kind of in the right ballpark. So, probably somewhere around 10 years ago. And they came out with the recommendation that added sugars should not be more than 10% of daily calories. And for an ideal health outcomes, it should be 5% of daily calories. So, which is always hard to kind of wrap your head around. So what does that mean? So for an average adult, let's say, who's consuming 2,000 calories, that's 200 calories from added sugar, 4 calories per gram. That's about 50 grams of added sugar. That's for an adult. And so it's going to be less for a child, obviously, because they're smaller. So I think that was very important. The USDA, the Dietary Guidelines for America, the most recent ones that were just announced in January of this year, it was good news and bad news. They also go along with this 10%. In fact, there was a lot of pressure on them to say 5%. They took a lot of heat because they didn't go to 5%. They said less than 10%. But for infants, brand new recommendation, 0 added sugars for 0 to 2 years of age. So that's huge. And that's what we had in the book, which we wrote, several years ago now, when we kind of came up with that idea. So I was happy to see that come out. The reality is people aren't really counting sugars every day, and we're not asking people to do that because that is very tedious. But I think it's good to get an awareness of what that looks like. And we like to kind of have people measure out, just so that you can make that comparison in your mind of what the sugar in a can of soda, for example, would be about 40 grams. If you weigh that out, that's about 8 teaspoons. That's about the daily recommendation for added sugar, according to the WHO.
And if you think about, if you added 8 teaspoons of sugar to your tea or so forth, the idea that you'd have, that kind of amount of sweet really does it doesn't seem complex, right? Yeah.
It's a great visual. I mean, I remember I taught at my daughter's school once, when she was little. They asked me to come in and talk to them, and I made a cup of tea, and I said, okay, I've just made my tea. Pass me the sugar bowl. And I started just adding teaspoons of tea to my sugar without announcing anything. And the kids were like, what is he doing? He's crazy. He's adding 8, 10 teaspoons. And then I mixed it up and I just went to drink it. And they're like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I just wanted to demonstrate that's actually how much sugar is in, a can of soda, that, and I want you to think about that next time you drink one, or a glass of apple juice. So I think it's a very visceral exercise.
I completely agree that it's very difficult to count sugar all the time, but the exercise is very important. And when you think about an adult recommendation being 50 grams of adult sugar, you can get up to 50 really, really quickly. And so if we're talking about
take that, for a kid, you're talking 15, 20 grams of added sugar, and a bowl of cereal could easily overwhelm that, or a baked blueberry muffin from the coffee shop, or a couple of cookies. You got to be really careful. You can easily overwhelm that amount.
Yeah, it really is a without trying to be too trying to harp on people too much, but it really does it is this sensitive in terms of when we're talking about children, the amounts of sugar that you can have in any packaged food really does take us over these thresholds. And the reality is that we do have to be mindful at least of packaging, of how much sugar is contained. How would you recommend people start to think about how we look at added sugar on food packaging? So for instance, for cereals, and how to go about that when they're thinking about reducing the added sugar for the family.
Yeah, I think so. So for breakfast cereals, we talk about 3 grams of added sugar or less per serving of breakfast cereal, and there's plenty of options out there that reach that criteria. Some whole grain cereals, it's you can't be fooled by the packaging, so don't be fooled by the front of label packaging. Whole grain, heart healthy. No, you got to look at the ingredient list really to figure it out. But the way to do it is, unfortunately, we have to be a little bit of a food detective, but you can make it into a fun project, because the food industry is just really good at tricking us. And so next, if you're next time you go to your pantry and you reach for the peanut butter or the breakfast cereal, just check the ingredient list and look to see the added sugars, not just on the label, but on the ingredient list. And that's an easy fix, because there's plenty of great nut butters or breakfast cereals that can easily eliminate those. And these are what we call hidden sugars, because you don't even necessarily associate them as being loaded with sugar, but often they are. So that's one way. And the 7-day challenge that we have in the book, that's one of the main lessons, is first of all, to see what you feel like and to see how your kids suddenly will be off of sugar, and you might discover a different set of kids. But the first lesson is, okay, check your pantry, become aware of the processed foods that are in your pantry that have hidden sugars in them, and just find different brands. And that alone can make a big difference.
I really like that about your book, because for people that are drowned in sugar, unfortunately today. And I remember actually when the first time I was beginning to count my own sugar and think about this, it is really overwhelming. So the idea of having a guided 7-day step into reducing sugar, really it does help a lot of people, especially when you're talking about a family, because feeding kids isn't an easy thing. I've got young children, and you really have to be on top of it if you're going to if you're really going to control how much added sugar is going in. So the book really does step through that, and I recommend anyone buy it and read it if they're struggling with this, and if it's something that's worrying them. It's been put together very well practically. Dr. Goran, there is a study by Jennifer Harris that looked at children who ate high sugar cereals versus low sugar cereals, and the outcome was a little bit surprising. And so I think, for parents that think that their kids need sugar, maybe, sometimes might be a misconception. How did that study show that the kids reacted to the different amounts of sugar?
Yeah, I love that study, and I cite it all the time, not just in the book but when I'm giving talks. Because for me, it was a paradigm shift. It was an aha moment. For the partly for the reasons that you just mentioned. So what they did was there was a study done at summer camp. So they had kids in a controlled environment, and they were randomized. They randomized the kids into two groups. One group, at breakfast, they just offered them high sugar cereals, Frosted Flakes, Honey Nut O's, whatever they wanted, but they were all high sugar cereals. The other group only had access to low sugar cereals like basic Cheerios, basic cornflakes, Weetabix, the ones I mentioned, 3 grams of added sugar or less. And what they found was that parents might think, oh, my kids will never eat that. They're never going to eat that. Kids were perfectly fine if that was what they had put in front of them. And they also gave them the choice of putting berries on it or chopped fruit. They also could open a sugar pack if they wanted to. And what they found was kids were just perfectly fine. They actually had just as much enjoyment of the low sugar cereals. They were more likely to top it with their own fruit toppings. And overall, they just had a much lower sugar load of a cereal and a much higher nutrient density. So my trick is go simple and build it yourself. So, and I was just at the grocery store the other day doing a comparison. You can buy basic Cheerios for $3, or you could buy the blueberry or chocolate flavored Cheerios for twice the price that have 3 times the added sugar, less fiber, less protein. Okay. Or you take your basic cereal for half the price and say, okay, here's the cereal, and here's some chopped fruit, here's some berries, here's some nuts, here's some flax seeds, some chia. Have at it. Doctor it up in your own way. Take control. Stay simple. Take control and just doctor it up your own way. You can easily have up the nutrient density just with a teaspoon of flax or chia. Kids love to do that, right? They love to make little mixtures. So that's my advice with breakfast cereal. Not a huge fan of breakfast cereal, but we do have it around for occasional days when we're in a bind. But just go for the low sugar variety, and you can easily kids will eat it if that's what they have in front of them, and there's ways to make them enjoy it, and there's ways to even make it more nutrient dense.
And there's some great practical steps in the book on transitioning those high sugar cereals. Some parents are looking at products, for instance, for high caloric sweeteners. What would you recommend in terms of looking out for terms on packages, and would you recommend they substitute these kind of the substances for sugar?
None. So I think this is a big problem. There's now dozens of different alternative sweeteners on the market. We just posted on our Instagram the other day about these fruit lollies that was advertised as sugar-free, but they had 3 types of sweetener. They had ASK, sucralose, and one other thing, and something called polydextrose, which is basically just glucose molecules all joined together. And we made the comparison to just, taking fresh fruit or even frozen fruit and just blending it and freezing it, and kids are perfectly happy with that. So don't be fooled by the labeling. We don't think that any of those sweeteners, even the natural ones, I don't know what they have in Australia, but in the US, stevia is very popular. Sucralose is very popular. Monk fruit, very popular. It's a fool's gold. They sound good, sweetness without the calories, but they have their own problems. They don't crave sweetness, that craving that we talked about. Your body is still going to crave sweetness and therefore crave food, and you end up eating more. And studies have shown that. And most of all, I just don't think they taste good. So, and that's why you see all these complicated blends of sweeteners in foods where they have proprietary blend of sweetener or 3 different types of sweetener. They're trying to like blast the taste buds so you don't even notice it, but it just doesn't taste good. So what Sugarproof is all about is don't go down that path. Just make your own. There's lots of different ways, and for me, I'd much rather bake a cookie or have my kids bake a cookie with actual sugar, just use less of it, and make it taste good. So that's kind of our strategy. Don't be fooled by these sweetener products, because it's really, they're not. Yes, there'll be less calories, but you may be tricked. If you had a choice of a plate of cookies and they were sugar free, it feels like you're getting a free ride. So you might end up eating more of them. Oh, they're sugar free, I'll just have another one. And therefore you've eaten less sugar, but you've consumed more calories.
It really is very difficult once you start to walk down a supermarket aisle and you see all the different packaging signs and the different ingredients. It is very overwhelming. So your recommendations to make your own and the practical steps in the book are very helpful. Dr. Goran, one more confusing point is the US FDA, they don't classify fruit juice as added sugar. Is that correct? Do you agree with this? And how would you recommend parents approach fruit juice?
Yeah, no, I do not agree with that at all. And I think that's going to be, very, very, very politically sensitive issue. I think it's problematic. We talk about eating fruit, not drinking it. And the issue is, if you have a glass of apple juice, let's say, that may have the juice from, let's say, 3 apples. And it's not added sugar, but it's liberated sugar. I think in Australia and in some parts of the world, we call that free sugar. So it's sugar that's been liberated or freed from its natural source. So technically, it's not added. It's not a sugar that's added. It didn't add sugar to juice. There are some flavored drinks where it's added sugar, but if it's just, even if you juice apples in your juicer, the problem is that you've concentrated the sugars and you've thrown away the fiber. And the fiber kind of counteracts things because it slows the release down. Remember, I talked about the rapid release. So the problem is when you have those liberated sugars in the juice, it's a massive dose on the liver, and that's the problem. Nobody's eating 3 apples all at once. Even if you eat 1 apple, it's a slow release process.
And just to clarify, back from our previous discussions, that we were talking about the way liver processes fructose, and so this fruit sugars is being processed in the liver. That's correct, because I think people get a little bit confused as to whether natural fruit sugar is fructose and how that's processed in the body.
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing. So fruit juice, let's say apple juice, which is the most common type of juice that's consumed in beverage form, is usually about 70% fructose, could be about higher. So remember I said ordinary sugar is 50% fructose. Soda, even if it's made from high fructose corn syrup, everybody knows high fructose corn syrup, bad, not going to drink it, is about 60% fructose. So apple juice is actually more of a problem than high fructose corn syrup when it comes to fructose, but it's called fruit juice. If it was called high fructose fruit juice, everybody would know it was a problem. But it's called fruit juice, and people think, oh, fruit, it must be healthy. But really, it's not only highly concentrated, but it's higher in fructose, and it's the fructose that's problematic. So that's why I have a real problem about drinking juice.
Michael, there's a question here from Kristen. She asked about, what about smoothies? Is that like fruit juice, and does the fiber also get removed?
Yeah, hi, Kristen. No, so that's an advantage of a smoothie, especially if you're blending whole fruit into it, which I recommend, because you retain the fiber. There is, there's some discussion out there about how much you blend it and whether that high blending shears the fiber to the point that you lose the fibrous effect. That may or may not be an issue. I don't know. So I would say don't overblend it, maybe. But I don't think it's a problem. I think homemade smoothies are great because you can throw stuff in there to up the nutrient density. You can add protein. You can add fruits and whole vegetables. So big fan of smoothies. Look out for commercial smoothies. I'm not a big fan of pre-packaged smoothies because those can have a lot of added sugars in them. I like to make my own. My kids like to make them as well.
Yeah, and then you know exactly how much is
You
going
know
in.
exactly what's in it. I mean, that's the thing. Take control. Build it yourself.
Yep. Doctor, we're going to finish up now, but the one last thing I wanted to cover is this is a big problem. This is an issue affecting our younger generation, and your work really has pushed this message throughout the community on how people can practically start to reduce the effects and reduce their risks of some of these conditions that sugar can have on them. How do you see this at a societal level? What do you think the next steps we need to do? Do you think a sugar tax is something that we need to be thinking about? What's your vision for the next 5 years as to what we should be doing?
I think sugar taxes are okay. I support sugar taxes. I don't think it's going to be enough by themselves. I think we're still waiting to see results from different countries and parts of the country, different countries around the world that have used sugar taxes. I don't think it's enough, and frankly, in this country, in the U.S., I just don't see it happening. I think politically, it's very challenging. I think the food companies have a huge lobby against taxes. Even in California, the food lobby was able to tell California that they could not introduce sugar taxes for another 10 years. So that's, I think, just a pragmatic approach. I'm just not sure it's doable. I think we need, marketing is an issue, but again, in the U.S., that's politically very challenging. And again, one of the reasons we wrote the book was because I'm convinced I'm not going to wait for the government to solve this problem or the food companies to solve this problem. I think that's just not going to happen. They may make small adjustments, even voluntary adjustments, but they're not going to be enough. I think we need to raise awareness in families. We need to raise kids who know about the dangers long term of what they put in their body and understand that. So I'm more about trying to get to the individual. Now that's really difficult, but I applaud people like Ronaldo. I don't know if you saw this, but we tweeted about it yesterday on my Instagram. I mean, just that one move by somebody like that had a massive impact. He pushed the Coke aside and lifted up a bottle of water. And I think that is so powerful. And I think the more we promote things like this and get to people like that who have a much more powerful influence than I do, I think the better off we'll be. So I think we're hopefully witnessing the start of a movement, and that's a movement that we're fueling at the base. And that, I think, is the way that we're going to change the generation.
Well, your work will certainly assist in pushing this forward, and I want to thank you so much for that. And the shares in Coca-Cola dropped $4 billion on that one footage from that. Amazing, really. That there really is hope here that we can change this.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I Instagrammed that yesterday with the video clip of him, and it had like 60,000 views and almost 7,000 likes. So I think people see that, they see the power in it, that can have an impact. And I think Coca-Cola isn't worried about me. Well, they were for a while. I hope they're not. They are worried about Ronaldo. And, they're going to say, oh, well, we have water. but they didn't have bottles of water in front of Ronaldo at his press conference. They had 2 bottles of soda. So I think that those types of changes are going to make a difference, and I'm excited about that.
Absolutely. Well, all the work that you've put in over the last decades is really helping people to understand this. And, I want to thank you very, very much for that. For those looking to get started, where can they find your work? And if you want to hold the book up again.
Yeah, this is our book, Sugarproof. It's available anywhere books are sold, online or in actual bookstores if you're getting into bookstores these days. It's available in Kindle, hardback, softback, in Spanish, in English, audiobook, wherever you're buying books. So yeah, we're also check our website, sugarproofkids.com, where in the book we have 39 recipes, but on our website we have dozens more that we're producing almost on a weekly basis. So if you go to our website at sugarproofkids.com, you can sign up for our newsletter and get those recipes when they come out, and follow us on Instagram at sugarproofkids, and that's where we make all of our latest announcements.
Well, thank you so much for all your work, and I'll definitely be, sharing your recipes with my children and all my patients. So it really is. It's a big assistance to have people like yourself that have been immersed in the research to bring these practical tips out. So I want to thank you very much for that. Thanks for spending the time with us today.
Thank you for sharing it with your audience and your followers. I think it's a collaboration from between a lot of people. So thanks for all that you do and for raising awareness. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Dr. Goran. We'll have to talk soon.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Okay.